Can depression be defeated? This is a question I would like to analyze today. Now, does it even make sense to say that someone can cure a person from depression, can heal a person from depression? Well, I would sort of like to believe that this is the case, given that I'm a clinical psychologist and psychotherapist. And yet, something that I really want to stress here is, what does it mean to be depressed, not just from the perspective of diagnostic tools that we use in psychology, but what does it mean more from a broader philosophical perspective? Now, I very often in my lectures, I talk about nature-nurture debates within philosophy, and I just like to summarize that in this context, nature-nurture means one extreme emphasis on neural activity versus the other extreme perspective on complete detachment from anything that is genetic or matter-based. So in other words, if someone suffers, if you take on the nature perspective, it's all your brain's quote-unquote fault because the brain made you do it. The opposite is true if you take on an idealist, so to speak, perspective that will force you to accept that you are the primary cause, if not the only one, for all your problems. Now, within the nature-nurture debate, from the perspective of psychology, there's something that I really like to stress, and this has to do with the way psychology is practiced, at least in this country. Well, psychology as a study of mind is by definition a integrative, holistic, we could say, approach. Some scientists consider it to be a full member of social sciences, and yet most of psychological research nowadays takes on a very behavioristic/behavioral perspective, which in itself is based upon biology. Now, this is a great thing because, first of all, biology is one of those scientific fields that can indeed be studied fully based on the pyramid of evidence, the scientific method. Now, this is true for the most part for all social sciences. We do indeed utilize, statistical evidence. We have both quantitative and qualitative analysis. But when it boils down to a deeper understanding of what a person is, does this type of psychology truly help? And the answer is a partial yes. Now, what is behavioral psychology, behaviorist psychology? I use these two terms somewhat interchangeably in this video, but please take a look at the following one, which will really investigate what behaviorism was from a historical perspective, what impact had this approach to psychology and neuroscience, I should say, in general. Now, within this approach, we have Cbt and Dbt as the two primary ways to investigate the psychological processes and help individuals. Cbt, of course, stands for cognitive behavioral therapy, and Dbt stands for dialectic behavioral therapy. Now, those two approaches are extremely useful because, especially in the context of Cbt, as the name implies, they really work on the way we perceive the world. They work on our thoughts and they work on our behaviors. So, the way we think and the way we act. This is also very objective, relatively so, of course, because we're talking about the complexity of human being. But it's a good thing because there is a level of objectivity in the way we analyze human behavior. And this human behavior falls in a spectrum. Now, what is above and below that spectrum is generally considered to be abnormal. But I want to stress the point here. Now, if you're suffering, if you're depressed, and someone is telling you you are not only depressed, and this is, of course, a heavy weight on your shoulder because it represents a clinical diagnosis, for instance, in the case of MDD, major depressive disorder. But not only that, but you're also somewhat split between your full responsibility for your actions and the way you feel, but also because you act upon such impulses. Now, what does it mean to feel depressed? Well, I would like to leave aside diagnostic frameworks for now. It's something that we will discuss in a future lecture. And there's plenty of material on the internet anyway in that regard, which does not mean absolutely that a person should just Google anything to self-diagnose a problem. This is something that I really advise individuals not to do. But if you've ever been depressed, I should say that you know how hard it is to really embark on any type of therapeutic effort, any efforts whatsoever, because it almost feels that everything is crushing your very sense of self under its weight. Now, depression is this enormous beast that really eats our sense of self from deep within ourselves. And it's something that it's very often described as a mental filter, something that captures our attention and makes it selective to the point of having this tunnel vision that only allows to see everything in very, very dark shades. Now, so it doesn't mean that depression is just a negative outlook. It is something that it's very similar to feeling very, very sad all the time. Well, that's part of it. It is definitely true. But depression and sadness are not necessarily the same thing. They're definitely not the same from a clinical perspective. And they're also not the same the way they're utilized in the field of medicine in general and in society at this point in general. Now, if someone says, I feel depressed today, now of course, this warrants a further investigation in the sense of what do you mean you're feeling depressed? Are you feeling sad? And permeate the term, are you feeling just sad, or is something more to it? This sadness represents an existential angst, an unfortunate series of events, sometimes represented by a pyramid of intense ruminative emotions and thoughts. Are you suicidal? Are you finding no hope nor purpose in your life? Now, something I want to stress right away is that help is possible. It is possible because there are different ways that we can approach the problem. The very first thing that a person should understand when they feel depressed is that whatever perception you might have right here, right now, it's not everything. It's not the full picture. And the reason I'm saying is that is because as a psychologist, very often someone is understanding what I'm saying from a theoretical perspective, but they might have some level of disbelief, not so much in my clinical skills and my ability to help them, but in the very fact that I might not be able to relate to them. So in other words, who gives me the right as a doctor, as a psychologist, as anybody really, to tell you how you should change your behavior? After all, I'm not you. I'm not in your shoes. I have no clue what you went through. So who gives me the right to even consider telling you things such as, I understand where you're coming from. I can relate to that. No, I don't. What does that even mean? Well, first of all, for the purpose of this video, I just want to emphasize that a lot of professionals that embark in this field might have suffered from depression themselves, or they might have close family members or close friends. And so they might have some level of understanding. But even if this wasn't the case, the comparison that I often make in my psychology sessions, in my psychotherapy groups, is, well, don't be too eager, and it's not really your fault, it's also part of depression, don't be too eager to judge the professional trying to help you, simply because in your mind, and you might have some evidence of that, this person does not have the same experience as you. Now, you will not, hopefully, have the same approach if you went in any other field within medicine, right? So, for instance, if you have to go to the medical surgical floor, right? You might have had a terrible accident and your lower limbs are in a very, very bad shape and you need surgery, right? Now, you will not expect the surgeon to have the exact same issue as yourself. In other words, you don't expect the doctor to have the exact same broken bone in the same position as yourself to justify their ability in helping you, correct? You trust that they study, hopefully, in a respected medical school, they practice those skills, they have experience, hopefully some research, and they practice, and therefore they know how to operate, correct? Now, the same thing happens to clinical psychology. Now, of course, there's something more in psychology that is on a deeper, more profound level than any other field within medicine. And I will also discuss why I include psychology within medicine in the next video. It's more profound because psychology, by definition, works on all multiple layers of human existence, we could say. At this point, we could even say that psychology is, by definition, a unfinished, could we say that? Unpolished, perhaps, version of philosophy. Now, when I say unfinished, unpolished, I do not mean to say that psychology is a wannabe philosophy without the depth of philosophical investigation. What I'm saying, however, is that if psychology only focuses on this behavioristic approach, okay, this matter-based or behavioral observation approach, then this type of psychology makes a lot of philosophical assumptions that are not quite apparent, and I want to discuss that a little bit here with you. Now, we talk about how can I help you not knowing who you are fully, because I have just met you, or maybe you were in therapy for a couple of years, for instance. In other words, I was not there when you were born, I was not there when you went through all the different traumatic experiences you might have had, so what gives me the right to even contemplate helping you here? Well, the first thing I want to share, as simply stated as it can be, is that because I believe that you can feel better. I believe you can do it. I believe that you have the skills. I believe that you have a purpose and a meaning in your life. In other words, you are worth it. Now, I don't want this to turn into a motivational speech type of video. And there are a variety of reasons why I want to say that. One of the things is that psychology has a lot of knowledge that is similar to the greatest traditions, philosophical, religious, spiritual, humanistic tradition in the world. And one of the things that separates psychology, the way it's done in the context of clinical intervention, is research. Okay? So while the values, the core elements, you could even say the golden rule, treat others as you like to be treated, right? Treat yourself, still apply. Psychology is based on scientific evidence just as any other field of science is. So this is one reason to at least contemplate embarking on this therapeutic path with a professional. Now, of course, this is not to sell the field of psychology. Let me state that accurately. You do not necessarily have to have any psychologist, psychiatrist, counselor, psychotherapist to help yourself. However, having the support of a professional really helps you understand those possible obstacles, name them, and once you name them, you have a control over them. Understand that they are not yourself. So, in other words, you are not your failures. You are not all your thoughts, not your positive ones. Thoughts come and go. You are not all your actions, but, and there's a really big but here, you are a product of this chain of events. So, from a transcendental perspective, every single thought becomes a pattern, a cognitive pattern, right? And the same way, every cognitive pattern becomes a primary way to interpret the world, our go-to place, our familiar cognitive environment, the things we do over and over again. And from this chain of events, from this pattern, the step toward behavior, it's a very small one. Now, once you move from the thought, the theory, you could say, to practice, to actions, that is not just the way you are inside, but the way you present yourself on the outside. And this is something else I would like to stress. Mental health issues are also social issues. You're not alone in this. You're not alone in this for two main reasons. One is the diagnostic one. The diagnostic one in a sense that I feel, and I use this term very broad, that you might be depressed if I notice based on our diagnostic toolbox, that your behavior, in other words, the way you present yourself, and I use behavior in a broader sense, your posture, your meta-linguistic presentation, your tone of voice, etc., tell me that this is not the norm. This is not at least a social cultural baseline for the culture and environment you're born and raised in. Okay? Of course, every type of psychology is an ethno-psychology. It's a cultural psychology. There's a cultural psychiatry, ethno-medical anthropology component to it. And of course, what is quote-unquote baseline/normal in this social cultural geographic area might not be the same in this other social cultural geographic area. But for the most part, once we understand where we come from, if I have a basic background, then I can tell you that this type of behavior doesn't fit the label of normal or baseline spectrum, right? So if I notice that, then the question is, what happened that caused these cascades, this triggering series of events that influence your behavior so much that will notice this difference, this disorder, something that's not in order, between the way you could be and the way you are. Now, this of course is very judgmental for me to say, and I'm asking you for your attention in this context, because of course there is a lot of judgmental element in assessing an individual. And again, this applies to all fields of medicine, but psychology has a special role in that. For instance, your behavior, your thoughts will indeed impact the way your system, your biological system works. Okay, so our body has an intelligence. Our thoughts will impact the way our body will react. Our thoughts, our state of mind will certainly impact the way our healing process will unfold. And yet with psychology, our thought process plays a fundamental role. And so if I'm trying to help you, I am noticing that what's out there does not fit your full potential. Now, this is something that it's also quite controversial, because I don't particularly like the, how can we phrase it? The utilitaristic, to some extent, goal-oriented productivity mindset that very often we have, even in psychology. So you need to develop skills to get better so you can achieve something else. We want you to get better because you need to do something else, because there's more to it. You have work to do. Now, this could be a motivator, and many motivational speeches focus on that. You know, rise up from the ashes just like a phoenix, and doesn't matter how many times you fall, you can push yourself forward. But the question is warranted: forward where? Toward what? What do I have to accomplish? And this is something that it's very, very important to understand. Now, let me restate it. You are worthy. It does not matter whatever your accomplishments are. You are worthy because you are yourself. Period. Now, I do understand it's a very big statement, and this is a statement that, of course, is predicted upon many other assumptions outside of the fields of biology, of medicine, of psychology, especially behavioral psychology, because they are constructed upon something that is universally and transcendentally true, something that goes beyond what evidence-based understanding within science can tell us, something that you might argue might come from a deeper, even spiritual, religious, philosophical understanding of human nature. I don't want to embark on that analysis in this video to distinguish and separate and maybe provide a deeper theological analysis of the way each philosophical, religious, agnostic, atheist, spiritualistic perspective defines human nature. But this is something that any type of psychology cannot be predicted upon without having the full belief of the intrinsic potential, the intrinsic beauty, and intrinsic worth of a human person. This is also based on the notion that words have power. So change is possible. You can get better. You can combat depression. You can become a better version of yourself. The point is not to brainwash you in order to change who you are, internal personality. The purpose is to remove all these layers, all these impediments, these obstacles, so that your true self, a beautiful self, a wonderful, precious, how can I define it? An individual, subjectively beautiful self that needs to blossom. It finally will blossom once we remove all these layers. Now, you might have all the rational reasons not to believe that to be the case. After all, you could even say, well, I practice a lot of psychotherapy. I did a lot of therapy. I went to several psychiatrists, psychologists, counselors. I did it all. We did 1,000 cognitive behavioral therapy exercises, DBT exercises, and still nothing helps. And still I'm stuck here, and nobody understands that all of these traumatic experiences, all these abusive, destroying experiences I've had are real. I'm not making stuff up. It's not a question of, just to quote the literature, cognitive distortions or automatic thoughts. I wish I could change my thought patterns, but my thought patterns are based on reality. So what about that? Now, of course, this is the case, and a good psychologist should definitely understand that. And this is not just a question of, yes, I understand where you're coming from, I value your opinion, but let's move on. Because unfortunately, this is practiced far too often far too often in our field, and I need to acknowledge that. But one thing that is missing here is the understanding that just because you have all these negative experiences, all which are true, you're not exaggerating them, okay? Let's assume that, okay? You went through all these experiences, there is nothing, absolutely nothing written in stone that will make these experiences be able to repeat themselves in the future. Alright, so everything that happens is true, is still acting on you, psychologically, emotionally, physically, spiritually, but you don't have to carry this burden forward in the future. In other words, your future does not have to be exactly the same as your current, present, whatever that means, or your past. Now, this is the part of psychology that helps a person understand that it's within your reach. You can defeat this. You can understand that after all, you are still carrying the burden of all these experiences. You are untouchable. You are invincible in a sense that none of this should have any power over you unless, permit the term, you allow it. Again, it is not your fault for feeling a certain way. And if you want to put a blame somewhere, we could put a blame on all these things. You will be right. If you feel depressed, and I'm using depression in this context in a very broad sense, you should, quote unquote, blame your sensitive brain, your neurotransmitters, cascades of dopamine and serotonin or epinephrine, etc., etc. You should blame some problematic issues at your gastrointestinal level, for instance, and it's plenty of evidence of the activation of such neurotransmitters in your GI tract. You could blame a TBI, you could blame an accident, you can blame something that life gave you as some sort of cynical, cold-hearted master. For instance, within the same month you might have lost your best friend, your job, your partner, your very sense of self. So life has, objectively speaking, been harsh on you. Not just that, but other people have done this to you. You've been abused, you've been made fun of, you've been bullied. There's a lot of things that can happen, all of which create this enormous suffering. And yet, you're not responsible for all these things happening to you but you are responsible in a sense that the word means you can respond appropriately to all this because you have the power. You can do this. And why you can do this? Well, because you're worthy, and as a human being, you have the potential to do so. So when I'm saying to my patient, I believe in you, I'm not saying that simply to make them feel better. Although, of course, this is part of what a psychologist does. My hope is that you will feel better. But I would not say that if I didn't have the full belief. I believe that, again, it's based on evidence-based research, as well as, thousands and thousands and thousands of accounts from other non-evidence-based, in the way we utilize this term in the West, sources, again, such as history, philosophy, religion, and so on and so forth, literature. So I believe you can do this. Again, you're not responsible for what happened to you, but you do have the power of changing things. How often, for instance, we find ourselves having this inner thought, very often personalized thought, in which we still deal with that horrible event that happened, for instance, in elementary school, we were bullied, or that night where that thing happened to us. I will not discuss details in this context, or when we had this harsh judgment from a family member, and all of these things are long gone. Some of our perpetrators, let's call it this name from the perspective of traumatizing experience, all these perpetrators might not even be alive anymore, and yet they're still alive in our heart, in our soul. So why is that we cannot let go? And a core element in this context to defeat depression, and I want to use this term, defeat depression, not to make empty promises, okay? And I will talk a little bit about the importance of having a multidisciplinary approach, okay? Because that's another danger. You're depressed and you think, well, I should be able to do this on my own. I watched plenty of YouTube videos, so I got this. Please, please, please do not make the mistake of embarking on such an incredible battle with your very nature, the battle for your soul, on your own. Ask for help, okay? So how can I defeat depression? Let's go back to this. How can I defeat depression, and a way to explore that? But it's also true that not every victim has to become a perpetrator, and there are things that can be broken in terms of chain of behavior, cross-generational chains, and there are also things that start almost from scratch, okay, with no other generational justification to be made, because otherwise we'll have a generation of abuse after abuse, and I really encourage people not to fall prey of that, right? Certainly there are things that are defining who we are, and this is extremely important from the perspective of social justice. Now, classical example of racism, right? None of you might have any responsibility, personally speaking, for what happened during slavery times, right? And yet, a way to open up your soul is to acknowledge that certain privileged position might be built upon something that 9 generations past have done from their perspective, in their lack of knowledge or purposeful lack of knowledge, that you are experiencing now as a result. It's not your fault, but it's a way to heal wounds looking back. Okay, so and there is certainly an individual path, destiny, karma, dharma, if you want to use this term, and a ethno-social karma as well. And this happens to victims of genocide, for instance, victims or perpetrator of genocide, of course, victim of unrecognized mass murders. Okay, so social components of mental health play a primary role. Now, giving back without completely forgetting is one of the ways out of this problem. There's something else to be said. Well, the other thing is, we are all human beings, and to some extent we all suffer. It's part of human nature. So I would like to talk about 2 things here. One is our tendency to focus on the negative, and the other one, a brief examination of what it means to find pain and suffering in the world. Now, starting from the first one, we have the tendency as human beings to disregard or partially disregard the positive and latch on negative elements. So for instance, if you're in any random room, you have like 100 people there, and you give a speech, you give a lecture, you interact with these people, and you administer a survey, you got your surveys back, and maybe 90% of the people there responded with phenomenal, very happy responses for everything you've done. They're very, very happy with your presentation or lecture. And yet you have like 1 or 2 people that really, really gave you bad reviews. Now, of course, you will remember those 2 bad reviews more than anything else. This is just our human nature. And of course, I don't want you to kind of glance over that and deny the weight, the existential weight of those 2 negative comments, but I simply want you to acknowledge that. Now, the reason why I don't want to pretend that those 2 bad comments are not there is because this is unfortunately some of the new agey pop psychology self-help attitude that very often we find in social media. Be strong, be yourself, doesn't matter what other people think, you deserve it. Yes, if this were only true. We cannot completely separate ourselves from the judgment of others. We might, if you already have the strong, deep, profound, transcendental knowledge that, for instance, monks might have. They're not detached from the world because they don't care, but they care so much that they don't allow their emotions to define their connection with other human beings. But if we are in this position, most of us will not be able to completely remove ourselves from our emotional response from other human beings. And we don't want that either, because that's how we develop empathy. That's how our mirror neurons work. That's how we function. Okay? We need other people's feedback. So part of cognitive behavioral therapy is actually also understanding the weight of such comments. Again, it's 90% versus 10%, or maybe even less than that. 90% versus 2%, and the remaining percentages are average comments, right? So first of all, we need to understand the weight of these numbers. And that's what it means to be rational, okay? We have a rational understanding of reality. We feel with our emotions. Thank God we have emotional intelligence, but we are rational. And rational as in we're using the ratios. We're using percentages. We use reality, evidence-based. We understand that our thoughts are impacted by the way we interpret reality, all right? But we need to focus on reality itself. In this example, again, 90% of the people were extremely happy with your performance. That is the fact that you need to focus on, okay? So in mathematical analysis perspective, 2, 5, 10% versus 90% simply does not win. All right, so this is the first thing. Now, we don't do this just in terms of random people. We do this with friends, with relatives, with professionals. So for instance, if someone tells you, well, you're looking good today, aside from the fact that unfortunately we have this tendency, especially in the West, of really using empty words or using words in an empty sense, an empty way. We say, how you doing today? And that we're not really prone or ready or don't even have the time to actually listen to the other person's response. It's just a greeting form, right? And that it's good at first because it opens up the conversation and there's truth to the fake it till you make it element to some extent. For instance, in the context of muscle memory, if you're forcing yourself to smile, then your body will actually start to remember how it feels to have a real smile, unless against all you do is faking a smile. You create this artificial layer on it. But if you're used to this kind of empty response that do not really mean anything, people just say it, then we are not really believing that. So if a random person tells you, you look good today, I'm happy to see you, if you're ready, start from if not depressed, a very lonely and sad perspective, you probably don't believe that. You probably don't believe, it's just not that you believe this person is evil or faking it. It's just, well, they just want to be nice. But listen to this for a second. This might be true in any random case that, people want to be nice, nothing wrong with that. But how about your friends? How about your close relatives? Of course, if you had an appropriately nurturing upbringing. Let's pretend you have a wonderful childhood, okay, and your parent kept telling you, I love you, you're the best. Well, you might say, well, you just say so because you're my parent, okay? So you might disregard the positive, okay? And I don't want you to make this mistake. A parent loves, or should at least love, their child unconditionally because they see the full potential. They're not yet swallowed by this depressive, mental, negative filter that makes them see only the negative, okay? Now, of course, this is in the best case scenario. Of course, no human being is perfect, and so they might have some issues themselves. But for the most part, at least from a theoretical perspective, that's what happens. What about a best friend? Well, you're just saying so because you're my friend. Well, have you ever considered that maybe, just maybe, if the person, your friend, did not see anything good in you, they might decide not to be your friend anymore? So the very fact that they stick around might be a further proof that you are a good person. Now, this, of course, also warrants an investigation of some inappropriate toxic relationship in which we have this negative codependent approach in which we bring out the worst from one another, and this happens to friendships, romantic relationship, business relationship. But the more you know yourself, the better you're going to be to detect that if that is the case. Third case, how about a mental health professional? Well, you're telling me that you believe I'm worthy and I'll be happy again and I'll be able to fight back against depression. Well, because that's your job. Even worse, you're paid to say those things. And this is another element. Certainly, in every job, you might find certain individuals that might be in the field for the wrong reasons. Well, first of all, that doesn't necessarily mean that they do a poor job. Although with psychology, I would really be skeptical about their clinical skills if they don't come from a position of honest appreciation for fellow human beings. They should not be in healthcare. But at the same time, the fact that we see your potential is because we experienced that. We are able to detect things that in that moment, because you have all this depressive filter, you might not see yourself. And this is true also for, the difference between our self-perception and perception of others. We can be so harsh on ourselves, so judgmental to ourselves, so ready to say that everything we do is false. And yet we might appear completely differently because, we have defense mechanism, we have ways to appear extremely egocentric and powerful and even arrogant, and deep inside we're completely afraid of being caught. We may have an imposter syndrome. We may even be paranoid because we feel that we didn't deserve anything in the first place, and the only thing that allowed us to be successful is either our luck or because we cheated on. And so we need to look back because someone else will do the same to us and we'll be thrown under the bus before we know it. This is also part of this prison that we build on ourselves, that we disregard a positive. Again, you're worthy because you are you, not because of any titles, any initials after your name, any specific amount of money or bank account or houses or cars or relationship, whatever. You're worthy because you're yourself. All right? So this is one thing why we need to understand how we discard a positive. The other thing has to do with understanding our interpretation of suffering and pain and sorrow and evil. Now, the problem of evil is something that is so wonderful and yet so complex and complicated from the perspective of philosophical analysis that we cannot cover in this video. But I would like to use a general perspective from the perspective of a general perspective given the scope of this lecture. There are multiple ways to look at life, but if we are suffering, the first thing to understand is that we interpret something as bad. All right, so we had a certain logical expectation of a chain event, and we were disappointed in our expectation, and therefore we were disappointed, negatively speaking, to interpret that outcome as negative. For instance, we started having Friday evening, Saturday evening meeting with friends. We used to do this for many weeks, and at some point what we consider to be our best friends stops calling us, stops wants to spend time with us, and just disappear from our lives. Now, we build expectations because what was a normal response, normal again, based on normal baseline of behavior, is that this shall continue unless we did something unforgivable for the moment, right? And sometimes things do change. Sometimes people do things that are not appropriate morally, ethically, emotionally speaking from our perspective, and so we are disappointed. Okay? And that really leaves a mark in our soul, leaves an open wound. Now, we interpret this as an unmet need, an unmet expectation. And again, it would be great to think that we are all able to give love unconditionally, but for the most part, as human beings, some level of mutual love is necessary for appropriate functioning. Not necessarily with the same level and the same rate forever. We can make the case that if you had enough quote-unquote love in a developmental time, from childhood, early adolescence, early adulthood, and so on, then you can live out of this love because you felt that wherever you are, you're at home. And that's why it's so important to love our children. But if you didn't have that, or someone took that away from you, then it's extremely hard to find love again. And so we kind of let on any type of leftover love. We settle down for anything that might not be actually what we need in our lives. We lower our standards. But in this case, you can point a finger at something at least. It's a behavior in our human beings. So you can justify this sense of evil because this is, in philosophy, human evil. It's something another person did to me. Okay? And it's very similar to what happens from a sociological perspective. And again, going back to what we said about abuse that not only is focused on one person, but a group of people, for instance, okay, genocide, for instance. Of course, this is not our expectation. Human beings should not behave like that. And yet we have, multiple accounts throughout history of this happening over and over again, as if we never learned anything from history. And so it's really hard to have faith in humanity if you see all of this. And yet in all these cases, you can still blame the person. And blame the person should not be really the ultimate outcome. You should blame the behavior. And then you understand that if you look back, again, as simplistic as it may sound, a lot of this perpetrator had abused themselves or had other issues they had to deal with, and they took it on the next person. So it's our ethical responsibility to break the chain, not just from the perspective of social justice, but simply because social justice is the same as individual justice. And that's a golden rule. If you love yourself, you love others. But if you love others, then you will be able to love yourself. Through others, you love yourself. Okay? Love the other as your neighbor. Okay? Love thy neighbor as yourself. It's more complicated to understand how to justify evil when evil is a natural evil. And this happens when we talk about earthquakes or tsunamis or hurricanes or anything that nature appears to have done with a purpose. And we have this inner split because we know we cannot really personalize nature, and therefore nature cannot be taken accountable as if they were a human being, if nature was a human being, or all types of medical, neurological issues, for instance, including mental health. Why did that person have to be suffering from depression, neurologically speaking? Why a TBI at such a young age? Why an aneurysm? Why Alzheimer's? Why everything in medicine? Why did they have to do to cause that to happen? And of course, there are answers for the problem of evil as well. And I would like to talk more about that in another video. But one thing that we have to keep in mind to help ourselves is that we do not have the full picture. First of all, we can always offer up our suffering. And offer up can be something that might appear a little controversial because it might sound hyper-religious in terms. What do you mean offering up? Offering to whom? To God? To whom? Well, offering up also means to make a sacrifice. And by sacrifice, I really mean the etymology of the word. To make it sacred. Sacred as in higher, separated from our everyday life. All right? And so in this sense, this is synonymous to opening up, to venting. This is the very first thing to do if you're depressed, if you suffer from any type of mental health issues, sharing how you feel. Even if at this point you're not feeling you're solving anything. A lot of psychology is based on that. And it's not different from counseling. It's not even different from sitting around the fire and sharing with your fellow tribesmen, for instance, how you felt. You might say it's even a less profound form of confession. All right, you're giving up your secret. You're spilling your heart on the table. So again, if you're not solving anything at this moment, at least you're not the only one carrying the burden of your fears, the burden of your traumatic experiences, the burden of all the abuse that you suffered. So first you were carrying all on this shirt, all this on your shoulders, and now someone else is helping you carry the pain. So sharing, opening up is extremely important. So in this sense, you're offering up your suffering, your sorrow, even if you don't know why that happened to you, to your best friend, to that innocent child, to that ethno-cultural, ethno-religious group that didn't do anything to deserve that genocide. You're sharing it. You share the love with another human being. And that's the first element. Now, of course, there has to be something else beyond that, because one of the dangers of sharing and opening up all the time is that we become progressively identified with that. We are identifying ourselves with things we share. So the same thing as, so to speak, detoxifying your soul, if I can use this term. So you want to get rid of your toxins, but then you don't want to dwell in this toxin because you're going to reabsorb them. All right. So part of psychology, and again, that's why I made this comparative between psychology and counseling, or also confession. You're giving up this existential dirt. You vomit your soul, so to speak. So the other person responsible for the cleansing process. Now, of course, in the context of psychology, it doesn't really matter if you're religious, spiritual, atheist, agnostic, the process still works. And I want to be clear about that. This video is not about finding truth from the religious perspective, although I value this extremely high from the perspective of what's actually working, but it's not a necessary step. All right? You can come from all different perspective, backgrounds, and system of belief in order to be able to accomplish that and to help yourself. So this sharing your deepest sense of something another person is what is going to set you free. It boils down to that. So I would like to conclude here for now. So there's a few things to bring home. First of all, you're worthy. You're beautiful. You are strong if you so choose. If you choose to be strong, you don't have to. You are beautiful in your uniqueness, in your subjective self. And it doesn't matter what you accomplish, whom you're dating, what letters you have after your name, what degrees you have, you're beautiful because you're you. Second thing, you can help yourself and you can be happy again. Happiness is such an ephemeral, broad, misunderstood concept, but let's try to be pragmatic from the perspective of this video. So you can feel better, you can do this. Third thing, you need to understand that the first step is always sharing how you feel. You don't have to share with everybody all the time. You can select the people that you want to share, but you don't have to be alone in this. You might feel that nobody's understanding you. You might feel that nobody has the ability to help you. You might feel there's no hope, but there's always hope. There's always a way out, right? And fourth thing, understanding that whatever happened to you, whatever evil you may perceive, some of which has no meaning or purpose, and you're done with all the people telling you, well, everything happens for a reason. Well, thank you very much. What about my reason? What is the reason for this suffering? Why is that? Even if you're in that moment in your life, and you feel there's no hope, there's not even hope, but there's not even a purpose, always remind yourself that you see just a very fraction of the big picture. And hope and help is possible. You will find the answers. You will feel better. You'll be able to defeat this. The first thing is trusting the process. You need to trust yourself, and also need to trust the path. Now, the path, this is the last thing, it's something that will come to you eventually. For some people, this path is community service. For some people, this path is finding meaning through science. Okay, my suffering stirs the pearl of science. For some people, this is God. the highest purpose. Okay, if you think about the pyramid of human needs, okay, the highest level, whatever path is, keep in mind that you could and should use these two foci, right? From focus, plural focus. As if your soul was a DSLR camera. You have lenses, multiple lenses, you can zoom in and zoom out. So the first focus is your immediate work on yourself. Everything we've said so far, okay? You need to do anything you can do to live another day, to find purpose and meaning right here, right now, in this very moment. Okay? You call a friend, you do whatever you need. You do psychotherapy, you work on integrative approaches to health, you play, you watch a movie, anything, you watch a painting, a landscape, you go for a walk, anything that focuses you in the present moment. Okay? Focus on yourself, keep working on yourself. But at the same time, you have something like a zooming out attitude and seeing the bigger picture. Now, this bigger picture might seem and look very far away from you. It's like you're looking at this beautiful landscape, but all you can see is bushes in front of you, and you don't even notice the beautiful sunset because it's just too far away. It doesn't even feel like yours. The only thing you need to tell yourself is that just because you don't see it yet, it still exists. And that is part of faith. It's part of trusting the process. Do not ever believe what depression is telling you, that you will always be like that, you're always going to be stuck, nothing will ever change, and people don't get it. Okay, the cynical part of yourself will make you think that it's not just the fact that I am miserable, but if life is miserable as well. If I see everybody around me constantly happy, well, they're either crazy or delusional, because if they could really see life for what it really is, they too will be depressed. Okay. Now, and this is also part of depression. Depression makes you think that your cynicism is the ultimate truth. It's not that you're negative, but you are more accurate and analytical than everybody else in reality as it is, which is bad, right? Now, of course, to sum up, I would never encourage anybody to see reality as happy if that wasn't the case, just to cover up, because it will not last anyway. It defeats the purpose and it's not going to work anyway. I want people to see that reality can be beautiful because it's your reality and you're beautiful as well. So I want to thank you for listening to me so far, and I wish you the best. You can do this, and I will see you